Hi, and thanks for visiting my channel today. It's the place where I discuss the history of spirituality and religious movements. Today is the first of a three-part series on the Great Awakening of Protestant religion in the American colonies. Not to confuse my regular viewers, I have a couple of different series going on at the same time, and the other one on Egypt, the religion of ancient Egypt, is still being uploaded, so watch for that, especially if you're interested in all things Egyptian. But today we're switching over to the Americas and to Protestants. This is what scholars call the First Great Awakening. It was a revitalization of religious piety that swept through the American colonies between the 1730s and the 1770s. Now, this was part of a much broader movement of evangelical revival that was taking place simultaneously in England, Scotland, and Germany, and to a less extent in other countries in Europe. And it was a new age of faith that arose to counter the Age of Enlightenment, as we call it, that had begun in 1715. It was to reaffirm the view that being truly religious meant trusting in the heart rather than the head. Feeling was more important than thinking, and relying on biblical revelation rather than on human research or human reason and knowledge. Historians have a technical term for this general movement. It's called the Romantic period or Romanticism. There's a reference to feelings as being superior to the intellect. The Enlightenment put a spotlight on reason and new knowledge, and Christians found this a threat to the fundamentals of their faith. This is, in fact, a scenario that will be repeated in future generations that I will cover in other videos. The movement crossed denominational borders, and it gave modern evangelicals an identity, a matrix for their faith. Beginning with the Presbyterians in the middle colonies of Philadelphia and New Jersey, it spread quickly through revivals of extemporaneous preaching. It went north to the Congregationalists and Baptists in New England, as well as westward and then into the South. Before I tell you more about the history of the movement, I do want to talk a bit about their theology. Revival theology focused on the way of salvation and the stages by which a person received Christian faith and then expressed this faith in their lifestyle. So stage one is the conviction of sin, and this prepares a person to receive salvation in their eyes. So the preachers emphasized God's moral law. They wanted to highlight the holiness of God and the sinfulness of humanity. So Calvinists also preached the doctrines of original sin and unconditional election. Now remember, Presbyterians were the Calvinists, the original followers of Calvin. Congregationalists were also Calvinists. Unconditional election is based on the idea of predestination, which they fully accepted. It's the theory that God chose, even before the creation happened, who would be saved, those people called the elect, the saved ones, and who would be damned, who would suffer eternal damnation in hell. Now, the preaching of these doctrines resulted in the convicted person feeling both guilty and totally helpless. The most influential revival was at the Congregational Church in Northampton, Massachusetts, not very far from where I am now speaking to you. That church was under the leadership of the then famous theologian Jonathan Edwards. In the fall of 1734, he preached a series of sermons on the topic of justification by faith alone. And the community's response to this series was just amazing. Signs of religious commitment increased, especially among the town's young people. Edwards wrote to another minister over in Boston named Benjamin Coleman that he had never seen anything like what was happening in his community. The revival there spread to 25 towns in Massachusetts and Connecticut until it lasted until 1737, about 3 years, when it began to die down. Edwards' sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," sent chills of terror through his audience to cause them to give up their sinning ways and hope to be saved. It's available online for you to read. I'll try to put a link to a PDF in the description. So as I said, revival in this church lasted some years with many people turning to God in stage 2 of the process. Stage 2 was labeled conversion. This is the stage of regeneration, when a person is actually experiencing salvation. This regeneration stage often lasted several days or even weeks, as true conversion must be accompanied by saving faith, a mind open to a new awareness of God, and a love of the gospel. It was a new birth, not just simply an outward profession of faith or conformity to Christianity. One discerned their new birth by self-examination. Now, the event itself, the new birth event, was considered instantaneous, but a convert might only gradually realize that it had occurred by this self-examination. Stage 3 was consolation. Even a person who believed they were among the elect might have doubts about the validity of their conversion or whether their faith was true saving faith. Revivalists taught that assurance of salvation was the product of Christian maturity. Assurance could only be gained through actively seeking the grace of God and mortifying, that is, destroying any sin in your lifestyle. The search for assurance required conscious effort on the part of a convert, and it took months or even years to attain. Another famous preacher of the awakening was George Whitefield. Now, he came to Philadelphia from England in November of 1739, and he preached there in Philadelphia several times. Then he traveled through New York, the South, and much of New England. He spoke at Harvard and Yale universities, and because of the large crowds, much of this preaching had to be done outdoors. It's said that in Boston, Whitefield spoke to as many as 30,000 people at one time. Well, other well-known revivalists from this first revival were Gilbert Tennant and James Davenport, Davenport being the most radical of the preachers. With the support of local ministers to sustain the revival, it said that there was a great and general awakening between 1740 and 43, with an emphasis on religious experience, emotional preaching. This was a new preaching style. It was very attractive to people. The normal style was to read a prepared sermon off of the page, and that could be very dry, and they were long and sometimes very technical, because especially in Congregationalism, the preachers were proud of being so well educated. So this emotional preaching style was just like the preacher was talking right to you, and the people really liked it. And there was also an emphasis on intense reactions. Sometimes people were fainting and very often weeping. The Puritan ideal of church was renewed, a committed, truly committed membership. It's estimated that between 20,000 and 50,000 new members were added to New England's congregational churches during this time. But there was also conflict regarding this movement. One thing, some of the traditional and moderate Presbyterians didn't like the idea of preaching the possibility of salvation to anyone, because they so strongly believed that God had selected the very few who would be the elect. So they thought that that was misleading in some ways. The traditionalists found the preaching style and the emotionalism was unbecoming to proper worship. Many churches split. They split right in two over the pros and cons of this type of spirituality. There were, in fact, 98 schisms in congregational churches during this time. People divided into camps called the New Lights and the Old Lights. It seems that, as with all spiritual movements, this one also had its supporters and its detractors, and there were strong feelings on both sides. Well, this isn't the end of the story. This revival is going to be followed by the second American Protestant awakening in the 1790s and early 1800s, and I'll cover that in the next video of this series. As always, thanks for watching, and I invite you to subscribe to the channel and get notifications for new topics. If you have comments or questions, please leave them for me. I try to respond to them all. Please stay safe and well, and I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.